Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Bombe Dry Fermentation Processed Ethiopia from Kawa Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Kawa, based out of Paris, France. And they're a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel multiple times before, including in our European coffee roaster tier list, where they were one of the coffee roasters we had the most feedback on, as it sounds like a lot of people really enjoy their coffee. And up to this point, we've had mostly mixed reviews, given that they do tend to lean a little heavy into the more unique and experimental processed coffees. So this felt like a great opportunity to review one of their more standard offerings, as this right here is day 34. And recipe we went with this coffee was similar to our standard recipe, at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I had a very slight preference towards the Chemex with this coffee, which would indicate a more medium grind. But for both brew methods, I did go a little bit more fine than normal for them. Now, roast profile for this one is a little interesting, as Kawa definitely does roast on the lighter side of things. But even then, I would say that this is light by most lighter standards. So for this cup, I would say it's a very light coffee in terms of the roast profile. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and the cup was surprisingly clean right from the onset, and given that I went into this coffee expecting maybe some more natural-like aspects to the cup given the processing method that it has, I was really surprised by just how much clarity there was from that first impression, as it did lean a little heavy into the more bitter citric aspects of the cup, but I was expecting a lot more of the fermenty or even funky aspects given the processing method, so I was very surprised to see it come out as clean as it did. A lot of the components I was feeling from this cup were some grapefruit as well as lemon-like aspects, so a little bit more of these bitter citric components to it, with this slight sugary aspect on the back end of the cup, so it definitely left an interesting first impression, as I was not expecting this sort of profile for this coffee. Day 17 ran into the Chemex, and the cup continues to remain surprisingly clean, as there was slightly less of the bitter aspects to the cup, and the listed melon that they had on here felt a little bit more defined in the cup. And that's why one of the reasons I had a preference for the Chemex with this coffee, it's because it did seem to have a little bit more definition to it when brewed through the Chemex. It was very vibrant and pronounced within the cup, especially on this day. Pretty bright and citric forward still in what was a very sugary coffee on the back end. Day 19. Ran it through the April dripper, and the cup continues to surprise, as there was no loss of clarity with this brew method either. They continued to focus a little bit more on a generic citric side of things on this day, with even more of the dark sugar sweetness on the back end of the cup. So this one was an okay day, not necessarily my favorite, so I didn't particularly enjoy it through this brew method. Day 22, back through the B60, and the cup continues to remain clean, if not quite as openly vibrant, as it started to skew a little bit more on the bitter citric side of things. And that's what I was noticing mostly on the earlier days when comparing these two brew methods, was the B60 really seemed to accentuate a little bit more of the bitter citric characteristics to it. So I would say there's this kind of lasting lemon water-like component to it with the dark sugar finish, whereas here on day 24, when it ran back through the Chemex, I was experiencing a lot more of the melon-like attributes and a much more defined profile to it. And it did seem to subdue a little bit more of the citric aspects to it. And this day, I actually ramped up the temperatures all the way up to 99 degrees Celsius. And that's why I had a preference for that as a recipe, because it really did seem to accentuate that, as well as a lot more of the fresh fruit characteristics, as I even felt like I was able to pull out some more stem fruits and coconut-like aspects within this day. Still continues to remain very clean with a lot of the dark sweetness on the back end as well. Day 27. Back to the B60, attempted the same thing, and the coffee did have nice consistency in terms of the fruit vibrancy, at least on these earlier days, as on this day it was a very pronounced characteristic, with much more of those fresh fruit, melon-like side of the coffee present through this brew method on this day. So temperatures really did seem to help with that, as it continued to have a very long-lasting dark sweetness. Day 30, another day through the Chemex, and it was on this day I started to notice the coffee shifting a fair bit, and that's one thing I noticed from the earlier days, was the coffee would shift, but it would remain consistent across brew methods. So when the coffee was shifting in the earlier days, it would stay pretty similar in terms of the V60 and Chemex. Same thing, but here on day 30, I noticed a pretty distinct shift to the coffee, as it started to skew very heavy on the more dark, sweet aspect of things, as it became the most dominant factor to the cup. A bit more of the brightness on the back end, but wasn't quite as enjoyable as I wasn't able to pull out as many of the fruit characteristics to the coffee on this day. Day 32 back through the B60, and it was definitely stewing on those darker aspects. So once again, that was the most pronounced characteristic to the coffee, as it did have a very lingering and long-lasting finish to it. It does open up a little bit on the cool down as there's much more of the citric aspect, but the coffee really seemed to skew a lot more in the dark, sweet side of things. I believe one of the notes that they have listed on here translates to molasses, which makes a lot of sense because that is very reminiscent of the dark sweetness that I am getting from this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and flip the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so we'll go through that one real quick. And then it's a finish at a level 5. And I don't really know what to say on that. I think that kind of took me by surprise because it does have that very kind of long-lasting dark finish to the coffee. That's been present from the earlier days, but the much more you've let this coffee rest, the much more you're experiencing from this coffee. And it really does seem to kind of linger and last quite a bit, almost to the extent of some of the more heavier processed coffees. So if maybe the processing method is coming into play, that's where it might be coming into play, as it continues to have that for the duration of the time you're drinking this coffee. All right, a handful of level 4s. We will start with the cleanliness level 4. As I mentioned on the earlier days, I was really surprised. It's very void of a lot of the natural characteristics in terms of the bunkiness, fermentiness, booziness, any of those things. It's void of those. If you served me this coffee blindly, I would assume that it was a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee, maybe a little bit more of a vibrant wash-processed Ethiopian coffee. And it is interesting to me that they do have just dry processed as opposed to something that maybe just says natural. So not entirely sure, maybe a little bit more background research as to what this processing method is specifically, but this coffee felt a lot more like a wash processed coffee. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, it is a very sweet coffee, but I would say that's a little bit more of a sweeter citric components to it, so I'm not entirely sure that I could justify level 5. Level 4 seems perfect, even if it is on the higher side of that level 4. Acidity, level 4. Yes, this was a very bright coffee, and that can be attributed to a lot of the more citric characteristics within this one. Like I kind of mentioned, Kawa does seem to roast pretty light in general, so it wasn't too surprising that this coffee had as much brightness as it did. So don't really have too much to say on that level 4. Feels pretty ideal for this one. Berry fruit, level 4. Yes, and I do have to put the caveats that this was much more present in the day 24, day 27 marks, as the melon would go into that berry fruit category. And when I was able to get it at its best, it was arguably one of the more defined melon characteristics I've experienced to a coffee in general, and say a little bit more of a kind of generic green melon as opposed to something more specific. However, even on those days, it was very well pronounced, so that one definitely justifies that level 4. Citrus, level 4. Yes, in addition to that kind of dark sweetness, that molasses-like sweetness, I would actually say that the citrus characteristic was the most dominant one in this coffee as well. Right from the onset, experiencing a lot of lemon, a lot of grapefruit, in a very pronounced and slightly bitter manner. So that citrus definitely justifies that level 4. I feel like maybe at its most, it could even bump its way all the way up to that level 5 mark, but I'm happy with it there, maybe on the more high side of that level 4. And then a couple of level 3s, so we'll start with the stone fruit. As I mentioned, certain days, most distinctly thinking that day 24 mark, I was able to get a lot more of those fresh fruits, the melon, and also that stone fruit aspect to it. So nice peachy characteristic to it. I've experienced that before from Kawa's coffees, and it's something that I do enjoy past them quite a bit. And then the bitterness at that level 4, level 3. Yes, definitely, and that's attributed to the citric component that's in it. It is a bitter citrus, so that's why it's as high as it is, as I could definitely feel that a lot throughout this coffee. And then the savoriness at level 3 of these, I didn't exactly know where to charge that dark bitter aspect to it, because I think it mostly goes in the sweet category. It isn't particularly a caramel-like sweetness whatsoever. So I think the best place I could kind of find for it was the savory, to kind of say, hey, this was a very sweet coffee, but it offered this kind of interesting, unique, darker, savory sweetness to it in general. So kind of the best place I could fit that in this tasting wheel, and just kind of the best way I think I could demonstrate this coffee in terms of that tasting wheel. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think as I was drinking this coffee, I came away with one big one, and it reminded me a lot of my favorite coffee I've had from Kawa, which was the Shantuin, the Musto processed version of their Ethiopian coffee. And what I noticed from that one was it started out so great, and I was really enjoying it, and it had some very great clean characteristics to it, enough to the point where I would have assumed that one was also a wash processed coffee. But later I got into the coffee, the less I enjoyed it, and that seems to be the case with this one, as those day 20, those mid day 20 to late day 20 marks, were really nice coffees, and here we are on day 30 going forward, and I feel like this isn't a coffee that I'm going to enjoy as much as I had on those earlier days. When it's at its best, it was I would say, much more enjoyable Ethiopian coffee for me in general. And going into this one with the expectation that I would have a lot more of a natural-like experience, only to have much more of a wash process-like experience, it was something I wasn't necessarily expecting, so don't really know what to make of this coffee. I think it's just kind of gone in line with my experiences with Kawa in general, that I'm not entirely sure what to make of their coffee. Might need to continue to try them a little bit more. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I think the first thing I should say is somebody that definitely is looking for a more clean coffee, because this one still offered great clarity in terms of the citric direction as well, because that one's skewed heavy into the citric component. But in addition to that, keep in mind it has a very long-lasting finish, and it's a very distinct and pronounced long-lasting finish, and that's in terms of that kind of dark sweetness present throughout the coffee. So factor those things in together in a much more sweet and a much more bright coffee, and I think that's kind of the best way I can pitch this for somebody, and kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything else from Kawa, would love to know your thoughts or impressions of it or them as well. Enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Bombe dry fermentation processed Ethiopia from Kawa Coffee. Thanks for watching.